The summer of 2024 brought the worst drought Illinois had seen in 4 decades. Rivers ran dry. Lakes retreated from their shores. And in a quiet corner of what was once farmland outside Chicago, an old well that hadn't seen daylight since the 1950s began to emerge from the cracked earth. It was June 12th when 2 teenagers with metal detectors searching for old coins in the dried field heard their devices screaming. They expected to find horseshoes or fence wire. Instead, they uncovered something that would finally answer a question that had haunted a suburban community for 34 years. Before we begin the story, write in the comments which city you're from. We're very interested to know where you're watching our video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. In July of 1990, the Kowalski family simply vanished. Thomas Kowalski, his wife Elena, and their 3 children, aged 7, 11, and 14, disappeared from their home in Naperville during what should have been the start of a family camping trip. For more than 3 decades, their disappearance remained one of Illinois' most puzzling cold cases. The investigation that followed would reveal how a trusted neighbor who led the search efforts had been living a double life, using the family's identities for financial fraud that continued until the day of his arrest. Thomas Kowalski was 41 years old in the summer of 1990. An aerospace engineer at McDonnell Douglas, he had recently received a promotion that came with enhanced security clearance. Neighbors described him as methodical, private, and deeply protective of his family's personal information. His wife Elena, 38, taught piano lessons from their home and volunteered at the local Polish community center. The children, Maria, Peter, and young Anna, were known throughout the neighborhood as polite, studious kids who helped elderly neighbors with groceries and yard work. The Kowalski family lived on Maple Street, a tree-lined road where everyone knew everyone. 3 houses down lived Leonard Braddock, whom everyone called Lenny. At 35, Lenny was a postal worker who had delivered mail to the neighborhood for 7 years. He organized the annual block party, coached youth baseball, and was the first to offer help when someone needed it. Lenny was everyone's friend, a former neighbor would later recall. He had keys to half the houses on the street for emergencies. We all trusted him completely. The seeds of what would happen were planted 12 days before the family disappeared. On July 3, 1990, Thomas received a registered letter from a credit bureau about an account he hadn't opened. At dinner that evening, Elena mentioned to the children that their father was dealing with some paperwork confusion at the bank. Thomas, usually calm, seemed agitated. He made several phone calls that night, his voice carrying through the thin walls of their split-level home. A neighbor walking their dog heard him say, "This is identity theft, plain and simple. Someone's been using my information." 4 days before the disappearance, tensions escalated from another direction. Thomas's sister-in-law, Paulina, arrived at the house uninvited. She owned a Polish restaurant downtown that was hemorrhaging money. The conversation, witnessed by a neighbor watering their garden, grew heated on the front porch. Paulina needed $50,000 to save her business. Thomas refused. "You have everything," Paulina said loudly enough for the neighbor to hear. "That promotion, this house, your perfect life. And you won't help family?" She left, slamming her car door and speeding away. The neighbor would later tell investigators that Thomas stood on the porch for several minutes after she left, just staring down the street. There was another potential source of conflict in Thomas's professional life. Derek Chen, aged 52, had worked alongside Thomas at McDonnell Douglas for 6 years. 2 weeks before the Kowalski family disappeared, Derek had been terminated from his position. The official reason was failing a mandatory drug test, but Derek believed Thomas had reported him to management. A letter Derek sent to Thomas, dated July 1st, contained the ominous phrase, "People like you take everything from people like me. You think you're untouchable because of your clearance, your perfect record. But everyone has secrets." On the morning of July 15, 1990, the Kowalski family appeared to be following their normal vacation routine. At 8:47 a.m., neighbors saw them loading their minivan with camping gear. Elena waved to a neighbor across the street. The children carried sleeping bags and coolers. Everything seemed ordinary. They were headed to Wisconsin Dells for a week of camping, a trip they'd taken every summer for 5 years. Thomas had told coworkers he was looking forward to disconnecting from work, especially after the stress of the credit bureau issue. The last confirmed sighting of the family was at 9:15 p.m. that same evening. They stopped at a gas station 12 miles from their home. The attendant remembered them clearly because Thomas paid with exact change and bought maps of Wisconsin, even though he'd driven the route many times before. The wife seemed nervous, the attendant would later testify. She kept looking at her watch and telling the kids to hurry up in the bathroom. Something happened between 9:15 p.m. and 11 p.m. that night. The family never arrived at the campground where they had a reservation. The minivan was discovered 2 days later in a forest preserve parking lot, 20 miles from their intended route. The keys were in the ignition. The camping gear was perfectly arranged in the back, untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. It was as if the family had simply parked the van and walked away. When the campground manager called the Naperville police on July 17th to report the unclaimed reservation, the investigation began immediately. The abandoned minivan raised alarm bells. Within hours, Lenny Braddock had mobilized the neighborhood. He printed missing person flyers at his own expense. He organized search parties that combed the forest preserve. He gave interviews to local news stations, tears in his eyes, describing the Kowalski family as the heart of our neighborhood. Detective Raymond Burke, who led the initial investigation, was struck by how quickly Lenny had organized the community response. Usually it takes days for neighborhoods to mobilize, Burke would note in his files. But Braddock had search teams organized within 6 hours of the missing persons report. He had maps of search areas, team assignments, even a communication system using CB radios. The investigation quickly focused on the obvious suspects. Derek Chen became person of interest number 1. His threatening letter to Thomas, combined with his recent termination and known drug problems, made him the logical suspect. When questioned, Derek claimed he had been home alone the night of July 15th, drinking and watching television. No one could verify his alibi. He seemed nervous during questioning, sweating profusely, and changing his story about what programs he'd watched that night. Paulina, Thomas's sister-in-law, was also scrutinized. Her desperate financial situation and the public argument with Thomas made her another obvious suspect. She had no solid alibi for the night of the disappearance, claiming she had been at her restaurant doing paperwork, alone, until past midnight. Security footage from nearby businesses was too grainy to confirm her presence. The $50,000 she had desperately needed became a focal point of the investigation. Meanwhile, Lenny Braddock continued his tireless efforts to find the family. He created a command center in his garage with maps covering the walls and timelines of the family's last known movements. He videotaped every search effort, he said, to review later for any missed clues. Local news praised him as a hero, the neighbor everyone wished they had. He gave interviews where he broke down crying, saying, "The Kowalski kids were like my own. Maria helped me plant tomatoes this spring. Peter mowed my lawn when I hurt my back. Little Anna." He would trail off, unable to continue. As the investigation continued, small details began to emerge that didn't quite fit. A teenage girl named Cassandra Moon, who babysat for several families on Maple Street, mentioned to her mother that she had seen Lenny's postal truck on the street very late on the night of July 15th, around 11 p.m., she thought. But when her mother suggested she tell the police, Cassandra backed down, saying she wasn't sure of the date. Maybe it was a different night. Teenagers, her mother told the police, weren't reliable about times and dates. The credit bureau issue that had troubled Thomas took on new significance when investigators discovered that someone had been attempting to open credit accounts using Thomas's Social Security number for several months before the disappearance. The applications had been submitted by mail, making them difficult to trace. The addresses used were post office boxes in various suburbs around Chicago. The investigation into this lead stalled when the post office reported that the box rental records had been purged after 90 days, standard procedure at the time. 3 weeks into the investigation, with no solid leads, the case began to grow cold. The FBI was brought in briefly, but found no evidence of federal crimes. Without bodies, without clear evidence of foul play, the case remained classified as a missing persons investigation rather than a homicide. The minivan was processed for evidence multiple times, but yielded nothing useful. No fingerprints except the family's, no blood, no signs of struggle. The months turned into years, and the Kowalski case became a haunting reminder of how completely a family could vanish. Every anniversary, Lenny Braddock organized candlelight vigils. He maintained a website with age-progressed photos of the children. He kept in touch with Detective Burke, calling monthly to ask about new leads. "Most people give up after a year or two," Burke would later recall. But Lenny never stopped. He'd send me articles about new forensic techniques, asking if we could apply them to the case. In March 1991, 8 months after the disappearance, something unusual happened that would only gain significance decades later. Paulina's restaurant, which had been weeks from bankruptcy, suddenly received a mysterious influx of cash. $50,000 appeared in her business account, the exact amount she had begged Thomas for. The deposit came from a corporate account registered to Midwestern Holdings, LLC. When investigators looked into it at the time, they found the company had been dissolved shortly after making the transfer. The trail went cold. Paulina insisted she didn't know where the money came from, but assumed it was an anonymous benefactor who had heard about her troubles through the news coverage of her brother-in-law's disappearance. The investigation into Derek Chen took a dramatic turn when his sealed court records were finally obtained. Contrary to his claim of being home alone on July 15th, Derek had actually been in a court-ordered rehabilitation facility from July 10th through August 3rd. The facility was in Rockford, 90 miles from Naperville. Sign-in logs, meal records, and bed checks confirmed he couldn't have left the facility without triggering alarms. When confronted with this information, Derek broke down. He admitted he had lied because being in rehab violated his probation from an earlier drug charge. He feared going to prison more than being suspected of involvement in the disappearance. With Derek cleared, attention returned to Paulina. Investigators discovered she had failed a polygraph test when asked if she knew what happened to the family. During the test, she became hysterical, hyperventilating, and crying uncontrollably. The session had to be terminated. When questioned again with her lawyer present, Paulina made a shocking admission. She had seen Lenny's postal truck on Maple Street late on the night of July 15th. Very late, close to midnight. But Lenny had approached her days after the family disappeared and given her the $50,000, telling her it was from someone who wanted to help but needed to remain anonymous. He said if she ever mentioned seeing his truck, people might get the wrong idea, might think he was involved somehow. She took the money and kept quiet, assuming Lenny was just protecting himself from false suspicion. This revelation should have broken the case open, but Lenny had a response ready. Yes, he admitted, he had driven through the neighborhood that night. He couldn't sleep, worried about the Kowalski family after Thomas had confided in him about the identity theft issue. He'd done a quick patrol of the street, checking if their house looked secure. And yes, he had helped Paulina with the anonymous donation, connecting her with a benefactor who wished to remain private. It was, he said, the kind of thing neighbors did for each other. The investigation continued to review physical evidence. The abandoned minivan had yielded one interesting detail initially overlooked. In the cup holder was a parking stub from a forest preserve, time-stamped at 10:15 p.m. on July 15th. But the forest preserve where the van was found didn't issue such stubs. The stub was from a different location, 30 miles away. Why would the family have driven so far off their route? And how did the van end up in a completely different forest preserve? As years passed, technology advanced. In 2005, investigators applied new forensic techniques to the evidence. Touch DNA analysis was performed on the steering wheel and gear shift of the minivan. The results were frustrating. Only Thomas and Elena's DNA was found. No unknown persons had driven the vehicle, at least not without gloves. Throughout the 2000s, Lenny Braddock's life continued normally. He retired from the Postal Service in 2008 with full benefits and a commendation for community service. He moved to Arizona in 2012, citing health reasons. The cold Chicago winters were hard on his arthritis, he said. He continued to maintain the memorial website for the Kowalski family, updating it with new theories and potential sightings. He even self-published a book in 2015 titled The Maple Street Mystery, A Neighbor's Search for Truth. The breakthrough that would crack the case came from an unexpected source. In early 2024, as climate change drove the worst drought in Illinois history, water levels dropped dramatically across the state. Old wells that had been filled in decades ago began to reappear. Environmental scientists from the University of Illinois were mapping these wells as part of a groundwater study. On June 12, 2024, 2 graduate students with metal detectors were surveying an abandoned farm property 40 miles from Naperville. The property had belonged to Walter Braddock, Lenny's uncle, who had died in 1995. The metal detectors went haywire near what looked like a depression in the dried earth. The students initially thought they'd found old farm equipment. They began to clear away decades of accumulated dirt and debris. At first, they found what looked like old leather, perhaps horse tack or bags. Then they found something that made them stop digging and call 911, a human skull. The forensic excavation that followed was meticulous. Over 3 days, investigators recovered 5 complete skeletons from the well, which had been 47 feet deep when full of water. Along with the remains, they found several crucial pieces of evidence. There was a digital pager, its battery long dead, but the device itself preserved by the dry conditions after the water table dropped. There was jewelry, wedding rings, a child's bracelet with Anna engraved on it. And sealed in a waterproof container, as if deliberately preserved, were documents, birth certificates, Social Security cards, and most remarkably, bank statements showing dozens of credit accounts opened using the Kowalski family's information between 1990 and 2024. The pager proved to be a critical piece of evidence. Forensic technicians were able to recover the last message received. Urgent, come home, neighbor emergency, 555-0147. The timestamp was 10:47 p.m., July 15, 1990. The callback number was traced to a payphone near a gas station in Naperville, less than a mile from Lenny Braddock's house. Even more damning was what investigators found next. At the bottom of the well, protected in a plastic bag inside a metal tin, was a microcassette recorder. The device was damaged, the tape inside warped and degraded. But forensic audio specialists, using advanced restoration techniques that hadn't existed in 1990, were able to recover portions of a recording. The first voice on the tape was Thomas Kowalski's, clear and angry. "I know what you've been doing, Lenny. I have all the credit reports, every application, every account. You've been stealing our mail, our information. I thought about going straight to the postal inspectors, but Elena convinced me to talk to you first. This is your chance to explain yourself." Lenny's voice, younger but unmistakably his, responded with panic. "Tom, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like. I was in trouble, serious trouble. I owed money to some very bad people. I was just borrowing your credit. I was going to pay it all back." "Borrowing?" Thomas's voice rose. "You've stolen our identities, our children's identities. This is federal crime, Lenny. Mail fraud, identity theft. You're looking at 20 years in prison." There were sounds of movement, furniture scraping. Elena's voice could be heard in the background. "Tom, please, let's just go. We'll deal with this when we get back from vacation." "No," Thomas said firmly. I'm calling the postal inspectors first thing Monday morning. This ends now." The tape continued for another 6 minutes, but most of it was too degraded to understand clearly. There were raised voices, sounds of a struggle, children's voices calling out in confusion. Then silence. With this evidence, investigators obtained a warrant for Lenny Braddock's arrest. They also searched his Arizona home, where they found even more incriminating evidence. In a climate-controlled storage unit in his garage, Lenny had kept boxes of documents related to the Kowalski family. There were credit cards in their names, bank statements, even tax returns he had filed using their Social Security numbers. In total, investigators documented over $300,000 in fraudulent credit obtained over 34 years. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was Lenny's collection of videotapes from 1990. Along with the search party footage that had been shared with police, there were private recordings Lenny had never revealed. Hours of footage showed him inside the Kowalski home during searches, methodically going through filing cabinets, photographing documents, even practicing Thomas's signature. In one recording, dated July 20th, 1990, just 5 days after the disappearance, Lenny could be heard muttering to himself as he filmed, "They're gone. They're really gone. No one will ever know." The arrest of Leonard Braddock on September 3, 2024, sent shockwaves through multiple communities. The 69-year-old retiree was taken into custody at his Scottsdale home without incident. Neighbors there described him as a quiet, helpful man who volunteered at the local library and organized neighborhood watch meetings. They couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the charges he faced: 5 counts of murder, mail fraud, identity theft spanning 3 decades, and obstruction of justice. As investigators pieced together the full story, the magnitude of Lenny's deception became clear. The reconstruction of events revealed a calculated plan that began with opportunistic theft and escalated to eliminating an entire family to avoid federal prison. Lenny had started intercepting the Kowalski mail in early 1990, initially just taking credit card offers. His gambling addiction had left him $40,000 in debt to dangerous people. Thomas's excellent credit score and meticulous financial habits made him the perfect target, someone who rarely checked his credit report and paid bills on time without scrutiny. The scheme had worked perfectly until July 1990, when a credit card company made an error. They sent a confirmation letter to Thomas's home address instead of the post office box Lenny had set up. Thomas, sharp and detail-oriented from his aerospace work, immediately recognized the fraud. He spent days gathering evidence, pulling credit reports, documenting fraudulent accounts. He discovered over a dozen credit cards and loans totaling nearly $90,000, all opened in his family's names. The fatal confrontation on July 15th wasn't planned. The family had genuinely left for their camping trip that evening. But Lenny, monitoring Thomas's activities through his mail access, knew about the scheduled meeting with the postal inspectors. In desperation, he sent the pager message that would lure them back home. He claimed there was an emergency, perhaps a break-in at their house, something that would make any family turn around. When Thomas confronted him with the evidence that night, Lenny had made a split-second decision that would haunt him for 34 years. Rather than face federal charges that would destroy his life, he chose to destroy 5 other lives instead. The microcassette recorder, which Thomas had been using to document the fraud, captured the moment when everything changed. Though most of the audio was too degraded to use in court, forensic linguists testified that sounds consistent with a violent struggle could be heard, followed by an abrupt silence. What happened next showed Lenny's postal worker knowledge and methodical nature. He used his mail truck, which no one would question seeing in the neighborhood at any hour, to transport the family to his uncle's abandoned farm. The well had been dry for years, unused since the property's irrigation system was modernized in the 1960s. It was the perfect hiding place, or so he thought. He staged the minivan abandonment carefully, wearing gloves, parking it in a location that would suggest the family had met with foul play elsewhere. He walked the 6 miles back home in the dark, avoiding main roads. The next morning, Lenny began his performance as the concerned neighbor. His immediate mobilization of search efforts wasn't just about appearing helpful, it was about controlling the narrative and monitoring the investigation. Every search party he organized, he led away from his uncle's property. Every theory he proposed to investigators pointed toward stranger abduction or Derek Chen's revenge. His tears in television interviews were real, but not from grief. They were from the crushing weight of what he'd done and the constant fear of discovery. The $50,000 he gave Paulina came from the fraudulent accounts he'd opened in Thomas's name. It was a calculated risk, buying her silence about seeing his truck while simultaneously making her look suspicious if she ever talked. The money was routed through a shell company he created and quickly dissolved, knowing that 1990s technology couldn't easily trace such transactions. For 34 years, Lenny continued to profit from his crimes. He carefully managed the stolen identities, keeping credit lines open, taking cash advances, then paying minimum payments to avoid triggering investigations. He filed tax returns in their names, claiming refunds sent to ever-changing addresses. When credit monitoring became more sophisticated in the 2000s, he shifted to using the children's Social Security numbers, knowing they wouldn't be checked until the children should have been adults. The drought of 2024 was something Lenny never anticipated. Weather patterns that hadn't existed in recorded Illinois history dropped water tables below levels from the Dust Bowl era. The well that had hidden his secret for 3 decades gave up its dead. When news broke of the discovery, Lenny knew it was over. He had already begun destroying documents when FBI agents arrived at his door. Detective Raymond Burke, now 71 and long retired, was brought in to consult on the case. He sat in the observation room as Lenny was questioned, watching the man he'd once considered a hero of community service. "I always thought something was off about how quickly he organized those searches," Burke said later. "But I dismissed it as eagerness to help. That's the thing about the best liars. They don't just deceive you about facts. They make you doubt your own instincts." Cassandra Moon, the teenage babysitter who had seen Lenny's truck that night, came forward with additional details she'd been too frightened to share as a 16-year-old. She had actually seen Lenny loading something heavy into his truck, struggling with the weight. She thought it might have been stolen goods and feared getting involved. For 34 years, she had carried the guilt of not speaking up. Her testimony, combined with modern forensic analysis of soil samples from Lenny's truck, which he had inexplicably kept in storage, provided crucial corroborating evidence. The legal proceedings revealed even more disturbing details. Lenny had kept trophies from the family. In a safety deposit box in Arizona, investigators found Maria Kowalski's confirmation necklace, Peter's Boy Scout compass, and Anna's tiny diary with entries about learning to ride a bicycle. He had transferred these items multiple times over the years, unable to dispose of them, but also unable to stop himself from preserving these reminders of his victims. A forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Lenny diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, complicated by gambling addiction and narcissistic traits. The psychiatrist testified that Lenny showed no genuine remorse for the murders, only regret at being caught. Even more chillingly, Lenny had written in a private journal discovered in his home about feeling powerful, knowing a secret that an entire community desperately wanted to solve. He had attended every memorial service, every anniversary vigil, watching people grieve while knowing he held all the answers. The trial, which began in March 2025, captivated the nation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: the fraudulent documents, the restored audio recording, DNA evidence from the remains confirming the identities of all 5 family members, and testimony from over 40 witnesses. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to Lenny's age and claimed the deaths were accidental, a confrontation that went wrong. But the methodical cover-up and decades of continued fraud undermined any claim of temporary panic or incapacity. During the trial, a heartbreaking detail emerged. Thomas Kowalski's mother, Helen, had lived until age 91, passing away just 3 weeks after Lenny's arrest. She had waited 34 years for answers about her son's disappearance. In her final days, knowing the truth seemed to bring her peace. "At least they're not missing anymore," she told her caregivers. "At least we can finally bury them properly." The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Lenny Braddock, at age 70, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Illinois had abolished the death penalty, but prosecutors noted that Lenny's age meant he would likely die in prison regardless. During sentencing, family members of the Kowalskis spoke about decades of ambiguous loss, the torture of not knowing, birthdays and graduations that never happened. Elena Kowalski's sister, Margaret, now 75, addressed Lenny directly. "You didn't just take 5 lives that night. You tortured dozens of us for 34 years. Every time you comforted us at those vigils, every time you cried those fake tears, you twisted the knife deeper. The children you killed would have been adults now, maybe with families of their own. You stole generations from us." Lenny declined to make a statement at sentencing, but in a recorded phone call from prison to an unknown recipient, played in court, he was heard saying, "I did what I had to do to survive. They would have destroyed my life over money. It was them or me." The complete absence of remorse shocked even veteran prosecutors. The Kowalski family was finally laid to rest in November 2024 at St. Adalbert Catholic Cemetery in Niles, Illinois. Hundreds attended the service, including many who had searched for them in 1990. The children were buried with toys and mementos collected by community members who remembered them. Thomas and Elena were interred side by side, their wedding rings returned to them after being held as evidence. The case led to significant changes in how missing family cases are investigated, particularly when entire families disappear. The Kowalski Protocol now requires immediate federal involvement and financial forensics when multiple family members vanish simultaneously. Credit monitoring companies now flag accounts opened for missing persons. The Postal Service implemented new safeguards against mail theft by employees. In an epilogue that brought the case full circle, investigators discovered that Lenny had actually written a confession in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, when he thought he was dying from the virus. He sealed it in an envelope marked "to be opened only upon my death," and gave it to his lawyer. The lawyer, bound by attorney-client privilege while Lenny lived, turned it over after the conviction. In it, Lenny detailed everything, including one final cruel detail. He had continued visiting the well every few years until his move to Arizona, standing above it and, in his words, making peace with what had to be done. The drought that revealed the Kowalski family also uncovered 17 other historical wells across Illinois, leading to 3 additional cold case discoveries. Climate scientists noted that extreme weather events caused by climate change might expose many more historical secrets in coming years. But for the families and friends of Thomas, Elena, Maria, Peter, and Anna Kowalski, the only thing that mattered was that after 34 years of questions, they finally had answers. The house on Maple Street where the Kowalskis lived still stands. New owners have renovated it completely, but neighbors say that every July 15th, someone leaves 5 white roses on the front porch. No one knows who does it, but the gesture continues. A reminder that while justice may sometimes be delayed, the memory of those lost is never truly forgotten. The case stands as a testament to how the most trusted people in our lives can harbor the darkest secrets, and how truth, like water seeking its level, eventually finds its way to the surface. In his Arizona prison cell, Lenny Braddock, now 70, and in failing health, spends his days in solitary confinement for his own protection. Other inmates, many of them parents themselves, have made it clear what happens to those who harm children. He receives no visitors, no mail, except legal documents. The man who spent 34 years as a respected community pillar will die alone, surrounded by concrete walls and the knowledge that his legacy is not one of service, but of unimaginable betrayal. The Kowalski case remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of listening to instincts. Detective Burke, in his final interview about the case, said something that resonates with everyone who followed the story. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it coaches your kid's baseball team. Sometimes it helps you carry your groceries. Sometimes it stands next to you at a memorial service, crying fake tears while knowing exactly where the bodies are buried. The Kowalski family trusted Lenny Braddock with their lives. That trust cost them everything. As this story concludes, it's worth noting that identity theft has become exponentially more sophisticated since 1990. What Lenny did with stolen mail and forged signatures, criminals now do with computer keyboards and data breaches. But the human element remains constant: the betrayal of trust, the escalation from financial crime to violence when threatened with exposure, and the devastating ripple effects on families and communities. The Kowalski family's story serves as both a memorial to lives cut short and a warning that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those we least suspect. The final image from this case that haunts investigators is a photograph found in Lenny's collection. The Kowalski family at a neighborhood barbecue just 2 weeks before they disappeared. They're smiling, surrounded by neighbors, with Lenny himself visible in the background, manning the grill. 5 people who had no idea they had only 14 days left to live, standing mere feet from the man who would end their lives to protect his secret. It's a reminder that tragedy often comes not as a stranger in the night, but wearing the familiar face of someone we thought we knew.